I absolutely hated Final Fantasy X-2. All things considered, it's very rare for me to actually hate a video game. Bland stuff like Starfield or Assassin's Creed doesn't really inspire hate, and outright bad games aren't worth losing brain space over. But there's a sweet spot where a game can be bad in a way that makes you upset that it exists in the first place. And that's where Final Fantasy X-2 landed, earning a permanent spot on my shit list next to People Who Don't Like My Dog and My Dog. But I'm a different person than I was when I first played it. I'm significantly less jaded about video games, and these days it's much easier for me to find the good even in an overall bad package. So for the first time in a decade, I want to go back, to see if I still have room in my heart to hate Final Fantasy X-2. As you might expect, the reason I hate Final Fantasy X-2 so much is Final Fantasy X is probably my favorite game of all time. In fact, it was the first game I ever reviewed, not for this channel, but for a college English course. It was the first time in my life I ever enjoyed writing a paper, and because of that experience I ended up taking classes on media criticism and ended up with this useless piece of paper I have called a communications degree. It's really tough for me to describe how highly I regard Final Fantasy X. I'm not blind to its issues, it's linear, overdramatic, and the dialogue can be off-putting, but the core story, structure, and setting is so flawlessly executed that it rose above anything else I played at the time. And to put it simply, it was never designed to have a sequel. It's actually the first direct sequel Final Fantasy ever had, although there have been plenty of sequels and spin-offs since. And it was mostly in response to how massively successful Final Fantasy X was. They gauged fan interest with a bonus cutscene included in later releases, although considering its contents directly set up X-2, it's likely they'd already decided to make a sequel by that point. But Final Fantasy X and its ending were not originally made with a follow-up game in mind, which I think is really critical. It wasn't a story that was rushed or inherently incomplete, it was a fully realized, well-told story. That's not to say you can't make good things out of an unplanned sequel, but you're working with a disadvantage from the get-go by having to work around a story that wasn't structured to have one. I'm going to summarize the events of Final Fantasy X here to give context for people who haven't played it, but if you don't need the summary, you can skip to this point in the video. The game follows the story of Titus, whose name I will refuse to pronounce any other way. He's a famous athlete who plays blitzball, which is basically soccer, but with more drowning. The game opens with an encounter with a giant whale monster, which results in him seemingly being teleported 1,000 years into the future. Here he finds the world has been tormented by the aforementioned whale monster for those 1,000 years and joins a group setting off on a pilgrimage to defeat it. As the journey goes along, you learn more about the world, one constantly oppressed by that monster called Sin. Sin will attack settlements, sometimes indiscriminately, but most often when an area starts to make technological progress. This oppression is so severe that there's essentially a system of ritual sacrifice in the form of pilgrimages, where summoners will visit temples across the world before giving their life to defeat Sin temporarily. This grants the world a few years of peace before Sin reappears and continues its rampage. The story positions you as an outsider unfamiliar with the severity of Sin's oppression. The summoner named Yuna and the rest of her party have lived in this world full of death and pointlessness for their entire lives, and as a result have grown to somewhat accept its brutality. Titus' status as someone who doesn't have that acceptance begins to rub off on the rest of them and sort of shock them out of their stupor, with his irritating energy serving to counterbalance the emotionally repressed qualities of party members like Wakka and Lulu. Most importantly, he serves as a foil to Yuna, who has never really had the opportunity to become her own person because of the perceived inevitability of her duty. Titus, being largely unaware of that inevitability, treats his interactions with her as he would with anyone else, which allows her to come out of her shell and start to become her own person rather than accepting her lot in life. Eventually, all of this boils over in a sequence where they kill the entity responsible for the previous system, forcing them to find a new way to deal with Sin. They do so, but the tragedy the game has been priming you for happens in reverse. Instead of Yuna dying, Titus dies, or more accurately fades away, leaving Yuna alone as the final symbol of all the people who felt lost as the result of Sin. I could spend an entire video talking about how well constructed I think the story in Final Fantasy X is, but to keep it brief, it's something that is just far more than the sum of its parts. Everything feels very carefully considered. The world building and atmosphere mesh with the game's linear structure, as the party can never stop to reflect on tragic events, only move forward. The constant unease about the pilgrimage and Yuna's upcoming sacrifice reflects the state of the world, one on constant edge, not knowing when the next attack will come. Sin's unique role as a villain positions it less as a traditional antagonist and more as a force of nature. There are sequences which especially highlight how powerless people have felt for the 1,000 years he's been around. Trying to stop him isn't dissimilar from trying to stop a hurricane or a tornado. You can't really do anything but clear the damage and rebuild. It's an incredibly melancholic game that's positioned as a tragedy from the word go. with its vibrant and colorful surface hiding an intensely depressing world underneath. There's positive messages to be found in it for sure, but it's an extremely sad game that executes many of its ideas to near perfection. And here is where the first and biggest problem comes in with Final Fantasy X-2. After this tragic story with a tragic ending, the tonal shift is jarring to the point where it's intensely off-putting, because Final Fantasy X-2 is basically Charlie's Angels. X-2 picks up a few years after the ending of Final Fantasy X, following Yuna as she lives on in the new world she helped save. Because there's no point in the summoner as a religious figure anymore, she becomes a treasure hunter searching for spheres, which are essentially the fantasy equivalent of DVDs. The opening sequence sets the tone for the game pretty distinctly, with a cringe-inducing J-pop concert followed by an encounter with a Team Rocket-esque cartoon villain. Here we see Yuna, returning character Riku, and new character Pain literally pose for the camera. This is a mind-blowing tonal shift compared to the ending of the original game, and I have to think the campiness here was intentionally turned up to 11 to set expectations. The main story revolves around one of the aforementioned DVDs, which shows someone who looks extremely similar to Titus, leading Yuna to believe he might still be alive. She joins a group of treasure hunters in order to both look for clues and find a new place for her in a changed world. This process leads her to revisit locations from the original game, seeing how people are moving on and forming new factions. The factions have a bit of conflict before the main story begins to focus on a giant superweapon that the Titus lookalike wants to use to destroy the world. The primary idea here seems to be opening the game with what amounts to a series of short stories before condensing it into something resembling a narrative at the end. In 8 of this, the structure of Final Fantasy X-2 is completely reversed from its predecessor. While that game was aggressively linear, X-2 overcorrects here and becomes obsessed with non-linearity. Right from the start of the game, you're given a massive list of locations to visit, which you can do in any order. A few of these locations are marked as critical, but if you only visit those ones, you'll miss something like 75% of what the game has to offer, as well as be extremely underleveled. So you're very much meant to visit optional locations before progressing the main plot. These locations will provide short events to take part in, some of which resolve quickly, and some which you'll keep coming back to as the game moves along, such as former party member Waka coming to terms with being a new father. We're going to talk a lot more about the story in a second, but let's touch on a few things first. Back when I first played X-2, I was incredibly confused as to how anyone could have enjoyed it. The reasonably high review scores were so divorced from my experience that I felt like I had to be missing something. With a bit more knowledge of the series, I kind of see now that I was missing something. For all of the complaints I have about it, which is going to be most of this video, Final Fantasy X-2 is a quintessential example of traditional Final Fantasy gameplay, and the last time the series reveled in those traditions before it started to become more experimental and change things up from game to game. This is the last time the main series would use the traditional ATB combat system the series had been known for up until that point, and sort of the last time it would use the traditional job system as well. Variations on these systems would appear in Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels, and the MMOs, but Final Fantasy X-2 was the last time they would really appear in the way earlier titles had established. For this reason, I think the combat has aged pretty well. Not necessarily because it's fantastic independently, but just because it represents the last time they really iterated on the base of the series before moving on to new ideas. There's a decade worth of ATB battle systems that they had to learn from, and you can tell. For those unfamiliar, Final Fantasy for most of its early life used a system called Active Time Battle. This is basically a slightly modified turn-based system where the turn timers fill up in real time. It's not appreciably different than the regular turn-based system, especially when you have it paused during menu selections, but it gives the combat a sense of pace and freneticism, especially in the boss fights. It's certainly not a flawless system, as a lot of it just amounts to punishing slow menu usage, but navigating around to make decisions adds an interesting layer to those decisions, especially once your options expand. And Final Fantasy X-2 really lets those options expand. The other Final Fantasy staple from all the way back to Final Fantasy I is the job system, and X-2 embraces that by not only bringing it back after some time off since Final Fantasy V, but sort of merging it with the active time battle system by allowing you to swap jobs mid-battle. This seems like a really simple thing, but adds so much depth to what otherwise would be a pretty simple combat system. You'll be prepping which jobs you think a character might need, balancing which jobs to level up to expand your options in tougher boss fights, and adjusting party composition on the fly to swap from offense to defense. In Final Fantasy X, there really weren't that many decision points until late game when you could start grabbing abilities from outside the main path. X-2, in contrast, has way more potential solutions to any given encounter and allows you to swap solutions on the fly if one isn't working. Later on in the game, you'll start to get access to accessories and job boards that will allow you to use a class's abilities without having it equipped, which expands your options with the opportunity cost of missing out on an equipment slot that would otherwise provide pretty meaningful stat buffs. This is again just really strong design. For a turn-based system to work, it needs to provide meaningful choices in and out of battle, and Final Fantasy X-2 does that brilliantly. If you're someone who only cares about gameplay or gets the nostalgia kick of seeing the ATB system and the job system, there's a very polished experience here for you. You're encouraged to do side missions thanks to the potential of maybe unlocking a new job that could change how you approach encounters. It's a fantastic reward when you finish an otherwise optional quest chain that results in a new class, and it had me doing more of the optional content than I otherwise would. As you might expect from a game pushing non-linearity, there's a ton of side stuff to do here. This can range from quests that expand the world to mini-games or short dungeons. None of these are that fleshed out, but there's so many of them that by sheer volume, some of it is going to be interesting to you. They can definitely feel a bit menial at times though, and taking a break to do unrelated side activities can negatively impact the game's pacing. I think it needed to do more in these sections, both from a story standpoint, which we'll talk about shortly, and from a gameplay standpoint. There's all in all just a lack of new content here. Almost all of the areas are recycled, and a lot of the new areas are just corridors with enemies and occasional side paths. These areas are often pretty visually bland as well, which just adds to the issues. One thing I do want to note is how much the game benefits from its re-releases. Not only with the addition of a decent chunk of new content, but also with the ability to do things like turn off encounters or speed up animation times. This is a pure positive. It helps people who want to speed up the grind, and there is a decent amount of grind in this game, but if you want a faithful recreation of the PS2 experience, you can just ignore them. I tended to only really use them when I was backtracking since the random encounters were a bit frustrating then, but they're an extremely helpful quality of life inclusion. The last thing I want to mention is the music. Final Fantasy X soundtrack was pretty iconic, with the main theme especially standing out. It's this absurdly sad piano track that sets the tone instantly as it plays over the opening scene. The music in Final Fantasy X-2 is really, for the first time I've experienced in a Final Fantasy game, just extremely forgettable. It's not bad, but for too much of the runtime it's just kind of there. It follows the rest of the game by being more lighthearted and poppy, but so much of it lacks any sort of punch or memorable quality. It's a stark contrast from the iconic songs of the original title, but it's understandable given that normal composer Nobuo Uematsu wasn't involved with the sequel. It's less of a black mark on this game and more just something that helps me realize how insanely good the music in this series usually is when something that's just average sticks out so much. Alright, I'm gonna rip into the story now. For most of you, carry on, but if you're a fan of Final Fantasy X-2 and ready to click off the video, I promise there's one thing about the story that is genuinely great. No stupid double talk, no qualifiers. There's a moment in this game that is genuinely fantastic and makes me happy that I pushed through to beat it all these years later, even if I strongly disliked the rest of the experience. So if you stick around, I promise there's one thing we'll be able to agree on. Before we begin, I want to touch on the tone. Yes, it's absurd. Yes, I have no idea why they followed up a game as tragic and depressing as Final Fantasy X with a lighthearted romp. Yes, I think it was the wrong choice in basically every conceivable way, but if I was going to be that close-minded, there's no point in giving the game another try to begin with. So despite disagreeing entirely with the direction they went, I'm going to try to meet the game halfway and judge it for what it is. It's a sequel, so judging the direction independently isn't exactly reasonable, but this is the product in front of me, so I'm going to just accept that and leave it out of a lot of this analysis. We might come back to it later depending on whether or not I remember to update this part of the script. Let's start with the characters. Your party of 3 consists of Yuna, Riku, and Pain. Of these 3, Riku gets absolutely no character development whatsoever. She's basically just there to bounce off Yuna and Pain as a more energetic comic relief sort of character. Pain gets some character development, but it's pretty minimal as it mostly amounts to just learning her backstory. This doesn't really cause her relationships with any other characters to change, so it does feel somewhat underrealized in a game that definitely needed more out of its party members. Her character design is also legitimately funny, representing early 2000s Hot Topic edginess so perfectly I honestly wonder if it was a parody. But in the end, this game is about Yuna. And there's room for that to work really well. Yuna had always sort of accepted her fate as a summoner who would sacrifice herself, so it's an interesting concept to see what kind of person she'd become and the life she never thought she would lead. This could also go hand in hand with her moving on after the death of Titus, pairing the stages of grief with a sort of coming of age story. And at times the game seems like it wants to go down that route, to the point where I think that really was the intention, but holy mother of God is it executed poorly. Let's table that for now and talk about the world. The benefit of a non-linear structure and encouraging the player to visit every location for every chapter is that it can build up the world with short stories that flesh out how society is adjusting, finally freed from sin's oppression. These are essentially sorted by location, as stories for places like Kilika and Bavel will usually have connective tissue between chapters. In chapter 1 you'll get an overview, it'll get expanded in the next few chapters before coming to something resembling a conclusion by the final chapter. Let's take a look at how it tries to go about this with an example. Besaid Island, which is Yuna's hometown and where Final Fantasy X begins, has a running subplot with Wakka, a party member from the previous game, becoming a father. Your first mission sends you to talk to him in search of a sphere on Besaid, where you check in with him and find out he's expecting a child soon. Once you complete the mission, you just kind of leave with things being unresolved. Later you'll come back to clear the Temple of Monsters, where Wakka comes to the realization that he needs to be less reckless now that he has a family. Towards the end, Riku gives him an inspiring speech on how to be a father while still being himself, and everything wraps up nicely. The big issue here, and one that pervades throughout the entire game, is just how short these interactions are. In Final Fantasy X, these moments were built up over the course of an entire game far more smoothly, as it was intermixed with the main plot. But with no main plot to speak of for the majority of the game, these character stories need to hold their own weight, and there's just not enough going on here to support that. The total cutscene time for Wakka's character arc is something like 5 to 10 minutes long, and he has so little dialogue and so little relation to anything going on with the story that nothing here hits. It doesn't earn the right to make you happy about a resolution. There's also a massive issue in that Final Fantasy X was never good about dialogue. It was great with creating emotions through atmosphere and world building, but the moment-to-moment dialogue was never a strength, and with a meandering structure and less interesting atmosphere, these dialogue portions once again need to hold their weight and just can't. The final conversation between Wakka and Riku highlights this, as it's just this weird stunted back and forth that takes two insanely talented voice actors and a moment that should be genuinely touching and just makes it awkward. It feels like Wakka needed more screen time and more involvement outside of his dialogue in order to make his character arc in this game feel complete. There was room here to interweave his conflict with the greater conflict presented by the story to strengthen them both, but because it's a non-linear game with dozens of other short stories to get to, it doesn't have time to do that. And here's the Shyamalan twist, because with all of those negative things said, Wakka and Besaid's story is the best one in the game. In my opinion, every other location story is somehow worse. The most common thread between these is a sort of conflict between two factions called the Youth League and New Yevon. There's also a third faction that doesn't really do anything, but it's there anyway. None of these sides are particularly well established. New Yevon is posed as a slightly less evil version of the genre-standard sinister religious organization from the last game, whereas the Youth League is trying to research Spira's past for some reason as they butt heads over New Yevon holding secrets. You're asked to make a choice to side with one of them pretty early on, and while this choice isn't permanent, you barely have any information on the two sides at this point. You'll likely have only encountered them once or twice depending on how much side content you've done, and you don't have a grasp on what their motivations or beliefs really are. Flash forward to the end of chapter 2, which is about 8 to 10 hours into the game, and the leaders literally vanish from the plot until the very end of the game. The tensions between factions start to boil over without their leaders, but again the game just hasn't done a good enough job at making you care about either side. You don't care about the shift in dynamic because the game hasn't done a good enough job at establishing what place they occupy in the world. It feels like conflict for the sake of conflict. It doesn't really add anything to the story outside of the inevitable late game reconciliation. When you work to smooth things over, it's a payoff that hasn't been earned. This is a common theme throughout pretty much every sub-story in the game. Kamari's efforts to lead his tribe, the conflicts between these factions, Wakka becoming a father, they all have so little time to establish the groundwork that it's jarring when the game moves straight on to resolving arcs it never really started. With Wakka, it at least can use his role in the previous game as a base, but anything the game needs to establish from scratch feels way too underdeveloped to land. Let's track back to the main story. I'll summarize it here because all things considered, it's actually pretty short. After the opening in which Yuna's new situation is established, the story shifts to a giant superweapon being hidden by New Yevon called Vegnagun. You journey underneath New Yevon's headquarters and start encountering evil versions of the summons from Final Fantasy X. Here you find Vegnagun is gone and the leaders of the factions have gone missing. You then start to learn about the Titus lookalike that started Yuna's journey. His name is Shuyin and he was in love with a summoner named Len. Len was forced to fight in a war that's part of the backstory for the last game, which isn't really worth getting into. In an attempt to end the war, Shuyin tried to use Vegnagun to blow everything up, resulting in him and Len being gunned down and killed. His anger over this resulted in him not being able to pass on. 1,000 years later, during the events of Final Fantasy X, the three leaders, previously part of the same military squad, discover Shuyin and he starts possessing one of them and tries to use Vegnagun to destroy everything because he wants to watch the world burn. You eventually encounter him and stop him by punching him in the face. There's a sequence at the end of Chapter 3 that I think highlights one of the primary issues with the overall main narrative. Here you first encounter Shuyin as he mistakes Yuna for Len. It's then revealed that it was actually the leader of New Yevon being possessed by Shuyin, who then summons a spooky portal and goes through it. The two other faction leaders follow him, and in this sequence it's also revealed that Pain has a history with all three of them as part of their old squad. This is basically the first development with Pain in the entire game, alongside a true introduction of the antagonist and hints about the importance of the three faction leaders. This is when the story actually felt like it was building towards something, like maybe things would start getting interesting. So what happens immediately after? Well, the entirety of Chapter 4 is putting on a concert. The game can't get out of its way. Every time it tries to do something to start some sort of intrigue or hook, it stops itself and returns to doing underdeveloped side stories or weird sequences that don't land. And that brings me to something I'm surprised I haven't really gone into yet. There's no getting around it. This game is excessively cringe. There's just no other way to interpret sequences like this. There's nothing wrong with a game having cringe moments. I constantly stan the Trails series, but Trails of Cold Steel has the whole rock concert thing that I legitimately can't get through without fast forwarding. It's fine for developers to try weird things, and it's fine when sometimes they don't land. If every potentially cringe idea got chucked into a bin, we wouldn't have the musical sequence from Alan Wake 2 or the entire Devil May Cry series. But at a certain point, you've gone too far. One of Final Fantasy X-2's biggest problems is that it's something like 90% cringe by volume. Over and over and over, there were moments that didn't land, moments I couldn't make it through without skipping or spacing out and looking at my phone. If there's one thing I remembered my previous experience with Final Fantasy X-2 for, it's this. From the opening song to every time they decided Yuna needed to say something spunky to an entire late game chapter being dedicated to putting on a J-pop concert, there's just way too much here to ignore. Let me organize this a little bit better. There's one question that needs to be asked about the main story, and it leads to why I think it failed and the one part that really succeeded. That question is, what is this game trying to do? Like I mentioned earlier, this game is about Yuna. It's about the person she's becoming, how she's processing the events of Final Fantasy X, and her place in the new world. But as you might have gathered from how all over the place everything has sounded so far, it isn't about that enough. That needed to be the focus, using Shuyin and Len as a parallel to Titus and Yuna and using their story to help her process loss. Because when the game actually decides to explore that, it's fantastic. Not just good compared to the rest of the game, genuinely fantastic. This sequence towards the end is legitimately powerful. In a callback to the repressed emotions from the original title, Yuna finally vocalizes her grief and relates it to how she's handling the main conflict with Shuyin. She rejects the idea of sacrificing someone for the greater good with the knowledge of how much it can impact the people left behind.
We destroyed our own allies. We destroyed the Aeons who had fought together with us at our side. We didn't have a choice then. We believed that was the only way we could save Spira. Do you know what it felt like to watch them die? Right before my eyes. The ones who should be smiling with me aren't here.
We had no choice.
We had no choice. Always we had no choice. Those are our magic words. We repeat them to ourselves again and again, but you know, the magic never worked. The only thing we're left with is regret.
Yuna, I'm sorry.
No. I don't want this anymore.
This moment is brilliant. This moment is what the game should have been building up to. This moment justifies the entire existence of the game, and this moment is why I'm glad I finally pushed through. because isolated from the failures of the rest of the story, this moment shows the potential this game had. It shows how a story centered around Yuna using the new world to reflect her difficulty becoming her own person and her difficulty moving on could have worked. And the game tries it really does sometimes. The sequence in Xanarkand where it's been turned into a tourist attraction, the fights against the summons that Yuna had an emotional link to in the first game. It's always on the verge of properly exploring this, but it never commits. It never makes a cohesive character arc. It works in starts and stops, beginning to explore these themes but never diving in, stopping to do another cringe-inducing musical sequence or wacky adventures with Looney Tunes style bad guys. When I look back at the story, I can see all the moments that approached greatness and started to explore its own potential. But you don't notice these enough when you play through them. It doesn't go deep enough for these parts to stick out until the very end when it has a touching emotional payoff for something it didn't set up properly. I replayed this game because I wanted to see what I missed. I wanted to see if it really was as bad as I remembered, if it was this irredeemable piece of junk tarnishing the legacy of a game I loved. And honestly, most of the time, it is. But this moment made me happy I came back. It's the spark of inspiration I was looking for but never found. And true to form, Final Fantasy X-2 takes this crowning moment and immediately ruins it by undoing the tragic end of Final Fantasy X and bringing Tidus back to life in the true ending. Yuna finally seems like she's reached the acceptance stage and is using the tragedy to grow as a person, and they just undo the tragedy. I don't know if I hate Final Fantasy X-2 anymore. I still don't recommend it in any way outside of purely for its battle system. I still think it made so many bad decisions, the good ones are barely recognizable. I still think the weird tone actively clashes with its stronger story moments. But I don't think it was devoid of purpose anymore. After revisiting it, I'll remember Final Fantasy X-2 not as purely terrible, but as a game that couldn't get out of its own way. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking or leaving a comment. It helps the video not get lost in the YouTube algorithm. These videos take a long time to make, so if you want to support it, I'll put a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description.